Welcome to the Finance Marketing Podcast, a show that empowers finance professionals to market their businesses in ways that feel good and actually achieve results. I'm your host, Hillary. I've been working with folks in financial services to develop marketing strategies that work and create results-oriented marketing content since 2020. And I've learned a lot about what works in finance marketing, what doesn't work, and where financial services pros get stuck. Join us each Friday as we explore real, effective ways to market your finance business and connect with folks who truly embody your ideal clients. My guest this week is Craig Andrews, a marketer helping high-ticket B2B service businesses close more deals faster at higher prices using first-time offers that will break your cash register. Craig is also a podcast host and multi-best-selling author. So Craig and I actually met in a networking group several months ago, and we instantly connected. One thing about Craig as a marketer really stood out to me. He writes about pages for his clients' websites unlike anything that I've ever seen before. The storytelling is incredible. And as someone who has always been a huge fan of the About page and who often coaches my clients on its importance and, right and wrong ways to do an About page, knowing that it's the second most clicked page on a website, I knew I had to have Craig on the podcast to talk about storytelling and what makes a compelling About page work. So in this conversation, we're really diving deep into the difference between transactional marketing and relational marketing and why storytelling is always key to attracting clients who are loyal and profitable and enjoyable to work with rather than the most headache-inducing ones. Craig also walks us through his philosophy that every single person has a compelling story worth telling and how finding those unique elements in your background can be the easy key to differentiation in a crowded market. So for advisors who want to build deeper, more meaningful relationships with their leads online, Craig's approach to storytelling and emotional connection is pretty invaluable. So without further ado, let's dive in. Craig, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Finance Marketing Podcast. We've been trying to make this conversation happen for quite a while now.
We have, and I appreciate your patience because I've been looking forward to it. And just for those listening, it's been me. We've been in the process of selling houses and buying houses. And I don't know, I think even my wife's injuries worked in there. And you've just been so wonderful in, letting us get this back on the calendar. I've been looking forward to this.
I have too. And I will say, I know there was at least one instance where my sick children caused us to reschedule. So it's not just you, but I have been really looking forward to this too, because you and I met in a networking group several months ago now at this point, and we instantly connected. And one thing about you as a marketer, Craig, really stood out to me. You write about pages for your clients' websites of the likes that I've never seen before. And I've always been a huge fan of the About page and often coach my clients on the importance of the About page. We know it's the second most clicked page on a website after the home page. And so I would love to start, before we dive into About pages, if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and some of your background.
Yeah. So, I have kind of a weird background for a marketer. I actually, all my degrees are in engineering. I've got a couple and a graduate degree. And, I went into engineering because I wanted to create things. I was like, well, who creates things but engineers? And they do, but I discovered the expensive way that it's not a field that rewards creativity. I mean, I did well. I got promotions. They were very happy with my work, but it was very stifling. And so I went off into the world of marketing. And one of the things I realized kind of along the way, one type of engineers, they program computers. They put in some code and the computers respond in a predictable way. In some ways, what I'm doing is still engineering because the code that I'm putting in is I'm programming the brain. I'm programming the brain to respond in a predictable way.
Oh, that's so interesting. So engineering was not the creative outlet that you thought it would be. Marketing could be the creative outlet that you wanted it to be. So go ahead.
No, and I did very well in school. I did very well in work. But it wasn't the fulfillment I was looking for.
So when you got into marketing, what were some of the first projects that you took on? Who were some of the clients that you started working with?
Well, my first move was I started marketing. I didn't stray far from home. I started marketing semiconductors for mobile phones.
Mm,
And the first big project that I took on, I was just very fortunate. There was a designer that designed a part that really changed the way mobile phones were designed.
mm,
And that doesn't happen very often. And so I was fortunate that I was able to work on that project. And there's a company everybody's heard of, Hewlett Packard or HP. And at the time, they provided test equipment for engineers. And what I noticed was they didn't have the best equipment, but they were always the first ones to get the phone call. And I just remember I sat around, I was like, how do they do this?
mm,
And because if I can figure out how they do this, I'll copy it
mhm,
and I'll use it in my stuff. And it hit me, engineers have an insatiable thirst for knowledge. They always want to learn.
mm,
So I was like, okay, I'm going to put together a marketing package where they will learn more if they work with us. They will become smarter. They will become better engineers if they work with us as opposed to other suppliers.
mm.
And another thing is they just have a lot of stress. They're overworked. They're always trying to minimize risk. And I decided, you know what? We're going to give them the tools where if they use our product, they'll be able to go home at 5. Whereas if they use our competitor's product, they'll have to work later.
Mm.
And there was a third thing. So engineers hate risk. They hate unbounded risk, and they'll just freeze in their tracks until the risk is managed. And my company that I joined had made the habit of sending products to the customers before we had fully characterized them. And the
Mhm.
customers would call us up and they'd say, hey, do you see this little weird behavior that we don't like? We're like, we'll get back to you. And like a day or two later, like, yeah, sorry. And so we had trained them to realize that whenever we sampled parts for them, we didn't fully understand the parts. And that was a barrier to selling them. And so when I put together my marketing plan for that product, it it was based on three legs of a stool. First, we're going to take more data on this part than we've taken on any other part. And when we deliver samples, we're going to deliver this data on a CD that's going to answer all the questions because they're going to come back with questions anyway. And we're just going to answer all the questions up front. And the second leg of the stool was we're going to make sure that they are better engineers when they work with us than when they work with our competitors.
Mm.
And then the third leg of the stool is what I mentioned. We're going to give them the tools. If they use our part, they'll be able to go home at 5 if they use our competitors' parts. Now, notice nowhere in there is, well, our part's better for these reasons.
Yep.
And so it was funny when we started sampling the parts. I went out on some of the initial trips and we drop off a part and they'd say, have you measured this? I'd say, yes, I have. As a matter of fact, I'd pull out the CD. This is back when laptops still had CDs or DVD drives. And I said, I'm going to show you where on this CD that data is, and we're going to leave the CD with you. And I put it in my laptop and I'd turn my screen towards them and I'd show them exactly where to find it. And they're like, okay, but have you measured this other thing? I said, yes, I have. Let me show you where this is. We're going to leave the CD with you. There was always a third question. Well, how about this other thing? I was like, yes, we measured that. Let me show you where the data was. They always asked 3 questions, not always the same 3 questions, but it was a test. They wanted to know, am I going to have to do your job or did you do your job as you should have?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that was a big reset that we had to do. And it worked. And the other 2 legs of the stool worked. And the product was really good. And for about 2 years, until we became complacent, as many companies do, we owned the market. Nobody could compete against us.
What's Go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
What really is standing out to me, and you kind of touched on this, is that, with the marketing, it wasn't really about selling the product. It was about solving people's problems. It wasn't even solving the business problems. It was how can our product solve the people problems they might not even know that they have.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing. And it's funny, our competitors actually got copies of this CD and they tried to copy my strategy. But
Mm,
what happens many times, they copied the wrong things. They didn't know what to copy. And I'd say
mm,
that that's a risk. Anytime you go off and you try to copy someone else, now I did it with HP, but I was just trying to answer the question, why do they always get the first phone call? And when I looked at it, I was like, this is why. This is how they're feeding the needs of engineers and how they've endeared themselves to engineers. And so engineers just trust them, even though
mm,
there's better products out there.
mm,
And and so yeah, it's and there's a lesson, to those that try to copy me, you have to make sure you're copying the right things.
mm.
I had somebody that hired, they poached one of our applications engineers in Taiwan, thinking, oh, this is their secret weapon. I met with them. It was a small community. A few years later, I told them, I said, hey, I really wanted to thank you for hiring Sam away. I always wanted to send you a Christmas card to thank you. And they're like, oh, he was horrible. And I said, yeah, I tried to get him fired and I lost that battle. They're like, I said, you guys were the smart ones. You guys fired him pretty quickly after you realized what you got. But thank you. You solved a problem for me. And so they were trying to copy the wrong thing. They thought, hey, this is the guy that's getting all the success in Taiwan. No, we were getting the success in Taiwan despite him.
Well, I think as marketers, one thing that we always say is, well, let's look at what your competitors are doing and we'll just see if we can do it better. So, what are the things that people should be copying versus not copying when they're thinking about rising above?
That's a really good question. And I don't know if I'll be able to give you a complete answer, but I'll give you my best shot. And it's a little bit, I'll just tell you, it's a little bit of a guess. I'm kind of formulating it as we speak. But I think you have to look at principles. What are underlying principles? And so when I looked at HP, I realized how they had built this emotional bond with engineers. Well, that's something you can kind of copy, or you can copy the principle of, I didn't do it the same way HP did it. I just recognized, oh, this is why engineers like HP. How can I do something that
Mm,
triggers the same emotions that they're triggering? So I actually didn't copy exactly what they did. I just copied the emotions they were trying to generate.
right. I think that's what it all comes back to is the emotions and realizing that people latch on more to emotions than they do to logic. I mean, this has been proven time and time again. Another thing that I want to kind of pivot to a little bit, Craig, is when you and I first met, you were talking about a wealth management firm that you worked with. And I believe that when you worked with the firm, there was some significant growth there that happened with the firm. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, we took them from 18 million in revenue to 60 million in revenue in a year and a half.
It's pretty significant.
Yeah,
Can you tell
yeah.
us a little bit about what some of the changes were that you implemented in their marketing strategy?
Well, the nice thing is we were working with good material. They had the goods.
Mm,
They just were horrible at communicating what they did. And you've spent a lot of time around the wealth management field, and most of the marketing sucks. They get compliance beats them down, and it's like, okay, we'll be boring. We got the message, and the but they had the goods. And John, the chief investment officer, we actually had a video clip of him on Fox Business where the host for Fox Business was saying, John, for 13 years, you've been quietly beating Warren Buffett's record.
mm,
Well, geez, when they have that sitting in the dusty closet in the back and they're not using it, all I have to do is pull it out of the closet, brush off the dust, and kind of put that out. I mean, like,
mhm.
oh my goodness, you have a third party saying that you've beaten Warren Buffett for 13 years?
Gold.
Right. The other thing is, John, John was a he wasn't a financial guy. He didn't look like Bernie Madoff. He didn't look like somebody I'd ever seen Wall Street. He was a computer science major.
Mm.
He looked like a computer science major. He dressed like a computer science major. He got his haircut where computer science majors get their haircut. And he went to the gym where computer science majors don't work out. And I looked at that. I'm like, John, you're adorable. Anybody would trust you. And so we just amplified who he was.
Mm.
And then there was one day I was meeting with his team, and they were just, we'd finished the meeting for the day, and they start telling stories about John. And I'm listening. I'm like, oh my goodness, I just struck gold.
Mm.
So the next week, I went back for our weekly meeting. And I said, hey, would it be okay if we changed your About Us page?
Mm.
And they're like, yeah, sure. And they've been happy with our work. And I said, well, actually, I have a first draft. And I slid it across the table, and they read it. They came back and they said, Craig, this is good. This is really good, actually. But there's one thing we'd like you to take out. Can you take out the bit about John being a gambler?
Mm.
And I said, well, I could. I knew that was coming. I knew that was coming. And I said, well, I could. But if I did that, that would remove the biggest trust building element of the story.
Mm.
And they said, we don't think you understand our clients. I'm like, I promise I do. And there was a moment where I think they were regretting hiring me. But fortunately, there was this young lady named Talia who said, Craig, do you have a way of testing it?
Mm.
And so I kind of paused and I thought about it. I said, yeah, I do. And so we put together the test. We invited them over to review the results. The results were overwhelming.
Mm.
And so they let us put it on their website. We put on their website that John, their chief investment officer, used to be a gambler.
Mm.
But it was part of what made John interesting and adorable, because when he was graduating from the University of Southern California with his computer science degree, he was spending the weekends in Vegas trying to use mathematical models to win at blackjack.
Mm.
So he's this geeky little kid that takes his geeky little education, goes over to Vegas and tries to use it to make money. And he had just graduated. He had just joined the firm about 6 months before Black Monday hit.
Mm.
And Black Monday hits, and the phones are going mad. Everybody's like, sell, 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 sell. And the founder of the firm said, and the only reason John was there was he was there to bring computers to this wealth management firm, because this was the 1980s and people were still figuring out computers.
Mm.
And so they look at him and they're like, John, get on the phone, convince these people to not sell. So here he is. He's 22 years old, maybe 23, straight out of college. And he's talking to people about millions of dollars. No, 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 no. You don't want to sell it. You don't want to sell it. And it was at that point he decided that he was going to change his focus. Instead of trying to make money in Vegas, he was going to try to make money for himself and for others by doing wise investing.
Mm.
And then he eventually grew to be a thing. And, and part of his story was, obviously he was being interviewed by Fox Business. He was on CNBC, multiple times. And he went to New York for a press tour. And the press agent said, John, would you like us to get you a town car, drive you around? Now, you and I would probably say yes. Yeah.
In a heartbeat.
Yeah. Not John. John said, no, let's take the subway. And on the way to the subway stop, they had a hot dog stand and had lunch. John was a value investor. It was at his core. No matter what he did, he was always looking for value.
Mm.
How can you not love that guy?
How can you not? So tell us a little bit about the test that you did, because that's interesting to me. They wanted to test it. How did you test out an about page to measure the response?
Yeah, so I have a blog article out there that I wrote back around that time about how focus groups and opinion surveys are ruining your business.
Mm.
They're horrible. Please stop. They it's not only that they give you incomplete information, they give you corrupt information. You're going to make bad choices off them.
Mm.
And it's all tied to the part of the brain that you're accessing. So 95% of your decisions are made in the back of your brain. Remember, I said I now program brains to get them to
Yeah.
act. That's the part of the brain that we're trying to impact. The logical part of the brain is your frontal cortex, but it only makes about 5% of your decisions. And here's why the opinion surveys fail. The only part of the brain that can answer why did you do what you just did or why did you make that choice is your frontal cortex. It's the only part that can answer a why question. But it wasn't involved in the decision. And when the brain's missing data, it fills in the gaps with just garbage. It's just complete, it's reasonable garbage, but it's garbage. And so at the time, I had a subscription to this really nice usability testing platform. And usability is all about task completion. You give users a list of tasks, they go off and complete the task, and you try to figure out how easy was it for them to do the tasks. Well, the people that sign up to do usability testing know that they're being measured on task completion. And everybody performs better when they're trying to be, they know they're being measured and they try to pass the test. So I had to do a little bit of decoy, to create some decoys. And I had them go to the About Us page and I told them, stop the camera. Now, my initial run of the test, I had them run the camera and I realized they were rushing through and they weren't reading everything. So I told them, I said, stop the camera, read this page. When you come back, we're going to ask you questions about this page. So again, think about the context. They're being tested on task completion. They know that they need to digest as much of that page as possible. My goal was I just wanted to make sure they read that paragraph where in 2 sentences we said twice that John was a gambler. And I just wanted to make sure that registered. So they did that. And I asked them, please recall some things that stand out to you. And we actually had one person start giggling when they talked about how John had that gambling fascination. And when I reviewed it with the client, I hit pause and I said, what you just saw was delight. You delighted the reader. You created an emotional response in the reader that drew them closer to you. That's powerful. So first thing was we made them think we were testing them on what they, did they get the right information out of that page? I just wanted them to read the page carefully. Then I had a whole bunch of red herring tests, or tasks. Please do these tasks. And that was just there to make it look like every other test they've taken. I had no purpose in those. And then finally, before they were done, I asked them, I said, please list the top strengths and the top weaknesses of this company. And there was one weakness. They said, we don't think they have enough diversity of investment strategies because they were, oh heck, they only have one strategy, the opposite of growth and value. They were value investors. That was their only strategy. And so that was the only weakness that came out. And so I never asked them, hey, tell me what you think about John being a gambler. Because that's kind of putting your finger on the scale and it's tapping into a part of the brain that can't really answer the question.
Right. Leading the witness.
Yeah. And I actually did do something differently with somebody. I knew somebody who was a high net worth investor. And I sent it over to her and I said, hey, can you read this and give me your thoughts? And it came back, real short email, very well written. I think I need to look for a new investor or new wealth manager. In other words, maybe I'm riding the wrong horse. I need to talk to him. So I called her up and I said, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? She's like, sure. And I said, what did you feel when you were reading that? What did you feel? And she started describing all these words that were like very adjacent to trust. And she wasn't finding the word trust, but she was describing somebody that was trustworthy. And I finally said, well, what did you think about his gambling? She's like, oh, that was a long time ago. Just immediately dismissed it. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to try to talk her out of her decision, which I didn't believe I'd be able to do. But I was like, let me try this. And I knew that she had grown up in an alcoholic home. And I said, now look, you understand addiction better than most. Once bitten, always bitten. Once a gambler, always a gambler. How in the world could you trust your money with somebody who has that addiction? And out comes what I was hoping to hear was the irrational explanation, irrational defense of a decision already made. She said, well, to be a good investor, you have to be a gambler anyway.
Oh, wow.
But that's the garbage. Remember
Yeah.
I said you ask a why or
Yeah.
something sounds like a why, and the
Yeah.
brain fills in the gaps with just garbage. That's a garbage answer.
Right. Well, I'm so glad that you kind of explained and dove deep in there because I can just feel some of the financial advisors listening to this just cringing at, oh my gosh, he put that he was a gambler on his about page. Why is it that that actually sparks this kind of trusting response in people?
An essential ingredient in building trust is you have to reveal a weakness, vulnerability, or flaw.
Hmm.
If you look at a TV show, they're always trotting out new TV shows. And you can almost predict when one won't last the season or won't go two seasons. The character is too perfect.
Hmm.
Yeah, and you've seen that. I'm sure you've seen an episode where the character was too perfect, and you're like, eh.
Yeah.
And it comes across as fake.
Hmm.
But when the writers intentionally write in a weakness, vulnerability, or flaw,
Hmm.
it draws you into them. There's no better example than Breaking Bad. Now, some people absolutely hate Breaking Bad, and that's fine. That's not the point. The point is that series drew in people. It's been seen as a massive success. So the producer, can go into Hollywood and say, hey, I want $100 million to do this goofy thing. They're like, okay. They'll write the check. And in that series, they made you fall in love with a whole bunch of really imperfect people.
Mm.
But it was the imperfections and it was the way they wrote the characters that did that. And so, the one caveat I would say is don't just randomly throw, well, hey, here's my faults, on your About Us page. Let me tell you all the ways I'm screwed up there, this way and this way. No, it has to be done very strategically, just like the writers in Hollywood do it strategically. But when you do that, you create that magnetism.
Right. So, did John feel nervous about posting that on his about page, or was he excited?
He was not in the meetings where we were talking about that.
Mm.
And so I never saw it, but I do know that at some point he touched it and he did what clients do. And he's like, oh, we need to add in this and this and this. I'm like, no, leave that out.
Mhm.
It's, and we write really long About Us pages. They're like 800 to 1,000 words.
Yeah.
And it's not because it's not because I'm trying to make it long. It's because I haven't been able to throw out any additional words. I need that number of words to accomplish what I'm trying to do.
Right.
So when you start adding in words that don't work towards the central goals of the page, one, you start losing the reader.
Mm-hmm.
And two, you just make it longer than it needs to be. And they're already, by pretty much anybody's standard, including my own, they're already too long.
Mm-hmm.
But we actually have videos, session recordings. We record people coming on the site. There's software that you can install on your website that tracks what they do. And we have session recordings of people reading 800-word About Us pages
Mm-hmm.
on their mobile phone on a Friday night about software development.
Mm-hmm.
And so people will come in, this whole belief that people don't have the attention span to do that is wrong. And, I always ask people who say that, I'm like, what's the number one podcast in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And people say, oh, Joe Rogan.
Joe Rogan. Yep.
How long is that podcast? 3 hours.
Yeah.
And we could go to video games. We could go to other things, people watching people play video games.
Yes.
People have the attention span as long as you have them engaged.
Yeah.
And, and John wanted to come in and talk about how he rode a bike to work. I'm like, John, that's not adding to what we're trying to accomplish here. But at some point you have to say yes to certain things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree with all of that so much, Craig. I think that a compelling enough story, people will read the story no matter if it's 100 words or if it's 800 words or 1,000 words. And I think that everybody has a good enough story, but finding that story takes time and it takes reflection and it takes finessing and it takes strategy to tell it well.
Yeah, and everybody is more interesting. Actually, some of the best about us pages that I've written, one was for a CPA, like
Mm,
the most boring professional in life. And my wife reads all of them. And for the long time, that had been the standard was, did it measure up to Cameron's story? And she's like, well, it's close to Cameron's story, but not as good.
mm,
Uh, and finally, the one story that broke through and set the new standard that we measure to is one about a fractional HR person.
mm,
Again, just incredibly boring career. But the point is, everybody has something interesting in their past.
mhm,
And I'll give you an example. I was prepping somebody for a podcast and, to get on podcast. And I said, you have to be interesting. Whatever you think unique knowledge you have, there's hundreds of other people out there saying they have the same thing.
mhm.
And I was like, well, tell me what you've done. Yeah. And I'm looking for something interesting in his life. And he's like, look, I'm Mormon. I've lived a boring life. Incredible statement. And I was just, I mean, I'm almost an hour and a half into it, and I'm just struggling. I'm like, I know there's something here. I just can't find it. And I finally said, look, you lived in Japan for 2 years when you were a missionary. So anybody that's lived in Japan for 2 years has had an experience that in Japan it makes perfect sense. In the US, it seems a little bit weird.
Mm.
And he said, well, there was the day that I had lunch with the Yakuza, and they propositioned me to run their prostitution ring.
Oh.
I'm like, really? You've been sitting on that for the last 90 minutes?
And were you able to turn that into a compelling about page?
Well, that was more to get him something interesting to pitch on podcasts. So we didn't
Oh,
do an
right.
about us page in his case. But yeah, I mean, and then it's just, yeah, here's something. I mean, I lived in Japan. I literally don't know anybody that's had lunch with the Yakuza. And and I don't know anybody that's been propositioned to run a prostitution ring in any country.
Of course, that would happen to what I'm assuming was a nice Mormon boy.
Right. And so the thing is, that kind of sets that hook. That makes you interesting. That's John, the computer science graduate that is trying to turn geeky computer science graduate trying to be a geeky gambler who
Mm-hmm.
eventually said, you know what, let me set a different path for life. It made him interesting.
Mm.
Everybody has something interesting in their past.
Right, right. And I think that what stands out to me about John's story too is it wasn't a gambling story out of desperation or, what you would think of as like who starts out as a gambler, but it was a gambling story that starts out of geekiness and interest. And I think that also maybe played a role too in what set that story apart.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's an adorable guy. Everything about
Mhm.
him is adorable.
Mm,
And my job as a marketer is just to let the world see that and they'll fall in love with him.
mm. Well, Craig, I love talking about storytelling and about pages and what makes each person unique in their story worth telling. Is there anything that, I haven't really asked yet or that we haven't really touched on yet that you think is pertinent to this conversation, someone who's struggling to tell their own story that would be helpful for them to hear?
Well, there's a lot of misunderstanding about marketing in my mind. And the majority of marketers are transactional marketers, they're direct response marketers.
Mm.
You plug a quarter in the machine, you hope to win the prize.
Mhm.
And so that leads to a lot of transactional techniques and business owners love it. Hey, I just spent, $1,000 on ads and I got, 3 new clients or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm.
It feels good. But the problem is when you do transactional marketing, you draw transactional clients,
Mm.
which are your least profitable, your least loyal clients.
Your most headache.
Most headache. You want relational clients. The relational clients are going to be interested in your story and your little gambling background and your, lunch with the Yakuza background. The relational clients are going to be drawn in. I mean, heck, that guy probably doesn't realize it, but that guy would pick up clients who just wanted to be able to say, yeah, my guy had lunch with the Yakuza. And
Right.
just to have the bragging rights that their guy had lunch with the Yakuza. But when you do the storytelling, what you're doing is you're creating emotional bonds and you're creating relational customers. And the relational customers are going to be your most profitable and your most loyal.
I love that, Craig. Well, if people want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, where are the best places for them to do that?
So I'm on LinkedIn, fairly easy to find me there, or they can come to my website, which is alliesforme.com. That's ALLIES, the number 4, ME.com. And you can find me at either of those places.
Perfect. And you have a great podcast that I was recently on a couple months ago.
Yes, thanks for coming on. It's the Leaders and Legacies podcast, kind of born out of my near brush with death and what
Mm,
my team did in my absence. But that's a story for another podcast. But yeah, it's, everybody has a leadership story.
yeah. Well, it's a great podcast, so I highly recommend. I will link to all of those in the show notes. Craig, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Hillary. This has been a delight.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Finance Marketing Podcast. If you're eager to market your business in a way that feels good and actually gets results, sign up for the Finance Marketing Podcast newsletter in the show notes so you never miss another episode. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite listening app and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. We'll see you back here next Friday.